Thinking positive thoughts is not enough to fuel your well-being. That's because you are an emotional being at your core. Hi, I'm Josephine Tite, founder of Positivity Center and a well-being consultant. Join me in conversation with friends who are willing to be vulnerable and share how they lean into their emotional center. Stop pouring from an empty cup, my friends, and instead lean in and learn to trust your heart. Welcome to Wellbeing That Works version 2.0, a heart-based approach. Hello and welcome to the show. I am your host, Josephine Tite, and I am joined here today by Cliff Turner. Welcome, Cliff, to the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're here. I just want to give you some time and space to share a bit about you with our viewers today. What would you like them to know about you and who you are?
Sure. I guess I'm not that exciting. I've lived a bit of an eclectic life. I've gone through the hurdles of entrepreneurship, owned a couple of businesses, and now I actually work with a financial institution with which I work with small business owners. So entrepreneurship has kind of always been a big part of my life. I find that very exciting. But then there's this part of me that also leans toward the creative and expressive side, and I do that through poetry. And I'm finding the more the years go on, the more that takes over. And I'm very excited this past year to have dug into it a little deeper than I ever have. And it seems like my path forward as far as taking care of myself goes.
Yeah, and that's a really intriguing thing you bring up, because one of the things that I ask most of my guests, and I ask you in advance too, is like, what does well-being mean to you? And I mean, like, we might as well just start off with a really big question, because you had a really great answer to this question. Sometimes people are like, oh, I'm not really sure, but you really knew for you what well-being meant. And this is what you said, just in case, you couldn't remember. But so when I asked you what well-being meant to you, and we can talk about it a little bit, you said, to me, well-being means having the ability to appreciate the pleasures and pains of life without getting lost in either, which is like, wow, we really have to unpack that for people. So tell me about that whole perspective of like the pleasures and pains of life from your angle, like just from your lens.
Yeah. I guess from my perspective, how to put it, I guess, for the first part of my life, I think from when my memory started, I found that I really gravitated towards the negative, what was going wrong, what hurt, what was not the way I wanted it to be. And I found myself lost in that, probably through most of my teen years into my 20s. That was kind of where my focus was. And I soon figured out that the reason that that's all happening is because it's what I'm choosing to look at. And it's like the whole red car thing, right? You think of a red car and I see a bunch of red cars. I saw all the problems. I was lost in it. And then I did what, a lot of humans do. I'm on this end of the spectrum looking at all that negative, and I went wham all the way to the other side. And I thought, well, that's not right. I'm going to look for all the positive in everything. And I went on this kick of, the world's great, everybody's wonderful, and I found that to be just as disappointing as that first position. And so eventually, now I'm in my late 40s, and I feel like I'm finally figuring out that, for me anyway, the healthy place to be is recognizing both sides of that, because we live in a world that contains lots of both, and just trying to find, where do I sit in this moment and deal with it, knowing that it's not permanent. I have the power to change my thoughts. I have the power to change my environment to some degree, and move forward with an effort to not just get stuck in one of those two ruts.
Yeah. So when you talk about getting lost in either, I think what you're referring to is sort of that toxicity that can exist on the ends of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
That's so
Definitely.
good. Yeah, because I tend to look at, I'm just nodding the whole time you're talking, because I tend to look at life more from a dimmer switch mentality. Because when I meet with people and talk with people about well-being, most of them live into this myth. It is a myth to me of like, I just have to think positive thoughts and everything is going to be peachy keen. And it like, it just bothers me to my core, because it doesn't acknowledge that there is pain or suffering in life, right? And then if you, again, like what I'm hearing you say is like that other spectrum is if you're just only living into the pain, you're not acknowledging that there's good things in life either. And
Right.
so, yeah. So is that what you're kind of saying is like, it's important to kind of acknowledge both?
Definitely. Yeah. I like the dimmer switch analogy.
Yeah.
That puts a good picture in my head. I think for me, I see it more as almost like a patchwork where I'm wandering around and I'm going to bump into something from this side of the spectrum. I'm going to bump into something from that side of the spectrum. But I now, after all these years, kind of have tools to deal with those and move through. But
Yeah.
what you were saying about the toxicity of it, just as an example, I remember when I moved into that let's be super positive mode, I looked at the idea of using what's it called, daily affirmations.
Mm,
So I wrote some of these up, and just out of, for an example, I am a happy person, and I put that on my mirror so I'd see it in the morning because that's what all the books told me to do. But every time I look at it, I'd think that's just reminding me I'm not happy. And there must be something that's causing that. But looking at a thing that tells me I'm happy isn't solving the problem. It's just reminding me I have a problem.
yeah. You know, we talked about that very thing when I took my diploma of positive psychology and well-being. We
Mm-hmm.
talked about the whole idea of our thoughts and our emotions kind of happening kind of in a cyclical pattern inside our brains.
Ah,
And the reason why positive thinking doesn't work is because you actually have to somewhere in your emotional or physical being believe the thought. So if you do not believe the thought, it never transfers into a physical or an emotional state where your body actually accepts it as truth to your body and to your mind.
yeah.
So that's actually why it's such a myth. Like to say to somebody, just tell yourself that you're happy all the time. In the long run, I think it actually, like you experienced it making you unhappy because you were being reminded that you weren't. I actually think that in the long run, it doesn't acknowledge, right? That, there's something there, like what's there that's maybe causing, grief or sadness or unhappiness or discontentment, like what's there to be worked through to process, right? And I think that's an important part of well-being is the processing. What do you think about that?
No, definitely. I think, when I went through that particular piece of learning, the next step for me was kind of being scared of that, like that there is a problem, but I don't know what to do about it. What is the process? And it was a fear of not knowing how to handle it. So again, I'd look away, right? Because I didn't have the knowledge to deal with it. And I feel that's been a growth thing for me over quite a few years too, is I still don't have that knowledge. I don't know what to do in most cases, but now I've developed the confidence that I've been through enough things and dealt with enough things that I have the knowledge that I'll figure it out, whether it's myself or through help from others or whatever. So now it's not as scary to look at the actual problem.
Yeah.
And just kind of have faith in the idea that, everything's solvable.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of
Yeah.
how.
So true.
Yeah.
Well, one of my kind of core, if you will, sayings is you have to feel it before you fix it.
Ah,
But I think our human tendencies are to do the opposite. So we want to just fix. And it comes from a very, loving place, I think, most often. We just want to, we don't like to see people, especially people we love, suffer. So we just want to fix their problem. But what about the processing of like just letting that emotion, teach you something, to move through you, like so that it builds you, it grows you as a person, right?
yeah, definitely. And that's where I found for me anyway, poetry has really become probably my most powerful tool in dealing with anything that's not sitting well with me, because it gives me it is really just a tool for me to sit in that emotion, put it into words, face it.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it doesn't present a solution, but it presents me with the process of getting through that feeling so that now I can think clearly about a solution. Right?
And I love that because sometimes there isn't necessarily always something in our circumstances that we can change,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like sometimes we can change things in our environment for sure. And sometimes we can't, or maybe just not in that moment in time. And so it allows you to be able to move. It gives you some autonomy, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Tell me a little bit more about how the poetry started. Like, was it something you did for a long time as a well-being tool, or like, how did that all start for you?
yeah, I honestly don't have a clear memory of how that works. I do remember in high school, I really enjoyed studying poetry,
Mm.
but I would not admit that to a single person around me because of the group I hung out with. That would just not be cool. And I love my English teachers because they had all these weird thoughts that I thought were amazing. But I just kept that all inside. And once I left high school, I just got caught up with life and never really thought about it. And yeah, I think it was I started revisiting old country songs is kind of where it started,
Interesting.
and realizing they tell such great stories, and some of them are so full of pain, and but listening to them is cathartic, right? And at some point along the way, I did write a song, or tried to. It's terrible, but whatever. And somewhere along the way, that morphed into kind of getting into a habit of writing poetry, and then eventually I was writing, once or twice a week, and I've just continued that. But
Yeah.
I don't know if there was a switch that said time for Cliff to do poetry.
Just happened over time, which is a
Yeah,
beautiful thing. It's just it's showing you that as a human, you slowly morph, right? There's things
yeah,
about you that can change. I totally believe that people can change.
yeah,
I don't like to hold on to a belief that we are born a certain way and static and can never change. So
yeah,
I believe that life offers us at least an opportunity to show up and show up in different ways for different things, for different people at different times, right?
definitely.
So this is going to be, you may have an answer to this. I'm not sure because we didn't really talk about this prior to hitting the record button. But is there a poetry piece that you feel really helped you process an event in your life? And would you be willing to share a little bit more about that?
Um, there's a few pieces like that.
It's not a matter of how. No, it's about spaghetti. It's about clock hands waving angrily and batteries drowning in their own sullen thoughts. It's about a jam you can never have because tomorrow always becomes today. It's about a distant piano and the wrong boots on a muddy path forever haunting. It's about rain and pudding. It's about the Cyclops camera winking frantically in stop motion at its irrelevant judgments. It's about what a loser and get a grip and get it right, you stupid kid. It's about paper ships singing their way into a whirlpool, praying for oblivion. It's about a low E string. It's about an omnipresent chickadee and the smell of fish surprising on a summer afternoon. No, it's definitely not a matter of how.
In a way, but how is it that the poetry helps you process the pain or the suffering, like those parts of life, like you say, so that you don't get lost in it? Because I think what you're saying is the poetry does help you not get lost in either side of the spectrum. So
Definitely. Like I think if it is a darker poem, it's usually because I'm experiencing something that's pulled me to a dark place, and before I can write, I sort of have to sit in that dark place for a while. And I don't tell a lot of people if I'm in that mode. I've learned that it's better for me to allow myself to feel it, because as soon as I tell somebody, it's kind of like you were saying before, they want to fix it, right? If it's somebody that cares about me, and that's the last thing I need at that moment. But then at some point, that feeling and that thought will start to formulate into, it, for me, a poem. And so that's when I start writing. And that, this sounds like a really gross analogy, but I don't know if you've ever had a boil.
a witch.
And a boil on your skin.
Oh gosh. Okay,
I've had it. Have you? Yeah.
I think I have. Yeah,
That's a really
I think
personal thing
most
to say
people
to
have,
yourself.
like at some point, right?
I suppose, yeah.
Yeah.
But that feeling when you pop it, and squeeze it, and it all, and then your whole body celebrates that thing is out of you, right? That's kind of the poem for me. Is once I've written it, it's like all that stuff came out of the boil. Now it's out of me. There's still a wound, and I need to bandage it, and this kind of stuff, but it's out. Now I can move away from it and deal, right?
Mm.
Um, so yeah, that's kind of where those ones come from, the darker ones.
I haven't had pimples for a really long time, but when I did, I
Uh-huh.
loved popping them. Like, so I totally hear you. The worst is when you get one in a spot you can't reach, like on your
Right.
back, and
Yeah.
then somebody else has to do it. And it's always my husband that I ask, and he's just so disgusted by the thought. But no, I actually can totally appreciate your analogy. Maybe not everybody can, sorry, but even like, and I do scroll Facebook sometimes. There was actually videos last year that were of like people in like professional skincare, that they were doing that. They were removing boils. And I was just like, to me, that's so fascinating. Like, I can never be a doctor. I can't deal with blood, but I can deal with pus. I don't know why.
That's funny.
But there is, yeah, that's a really interesting analogy. But there's an expression of, right? That something needs to come out because it's like it's toxic if it doesn't come out.
Right.
Yes, is really the whole point of our gross analogy.
Yeah. Yeah, that is pretty gross now that I think about it.
That's right. But how do we, like, okay, that biological example is like cool because here's the one thing it has that I believe that sometimes our emotions don't necessarily, or we don't necessarily have that proper relationship with our emotions. But it's when it's a boil, you can touch it, you can feel it, you know it's there, and it becomes painful. How do we, like, what happens when we need to have that relationship with the emotions that are happening so we can like notice them and find a way for them to, be expressed, to be processed? Do you have sort of a thought on that?
For me personally, I think it's solitude. I do my best healing and dealing. Hey, look at rhymes coming out already. Healing and dealing when I'm alone and stuck in those kinds of situations, right? And I think for me, again, totally just my take on it. As soon as I try to bring somebody else into it, my nature is to just try to make other people feel good when they're around me, and a lot of times that's not appropriate, and I try to do it anyway, and I know it's a problem. But if I'm trying to deal with something of my own and there's somebody else around, I can't think for myself anymore. So for me, it is that solitude. I have to find that, otherwise it'll just fester and that boil gets so big it's like turned into a giant goiter on my neck, and I'm getting really gross now.
Well, that's so interesting. So do you, like, I remember even talking about another subject we talked a lot about was like introvertedness versus extrovertedness. And that you don't necessarily always have to be like one. I think a lot of researchers in the field of positive psychology are kind of anti-label, because then it's not that the label's not good, because in many cases it can give you direction, right? But then sometimes it can put you in a box, right? And so do you find that you enjoy that solitude, the introverted nature of yourself, because you do so much extrovertedness, or people, like connecting with people in other parts of your life? Do you think that it's that, or do you think you just like really like you prefer to be inside yourself?
I think you're 100% right, because when you say that, it makes me think like with my work outside of poetry, I do some public speaking. I'm every day talking with individuals through meetings. I love going to networking events to try to make connections. Like, I enjoy that stuff, but it's draining for me, even though I enjoy it and I'm okay at doing it. I just like, I need my solitude after that too. So yeah, maybe that does play into it. When I'm in a rough spot, I just need even more of that solitude.
Yeah. Well, I think you point out to a really good, an interesting factor, which is the energy component, because it's really true. We're capable of lots, but not everything fuels us with energy. And when it comes to well-being, it's really important, I believe, to look at what is it that's fueling your well-being. And when I ask that question, I put the word fuel purposefully in there, like, right? Because it's kind of like, almost a gas can analogy for a car, where, if you continue to drive your car and never stop and fill up for gas, your car just isn't going to get there. Right. So what are the gas stops, the gas stations? And, when do you decide and what do you do that is like literally pouring the fuel into your gas tank, right? As a human being. So for you, it's like you really love being by yourself.
I do. Yeah.
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 I love that, because like most people on the show, that I would say, if I just kind of reflect back without having had in-depth conversations, is like they really do. It's a lot of extroverted things, right? But I actually, the very first show that I ever had was with someone who had coached me as well. And his well-being tool and practice was actually, VR video games. And I was like, wow, so cool. Like, and I think the whole thing here is like, you use it intentionally as a well-being practice, right? Yeah. And you use it intentionally as a well-being practice. And I think that's the whole point. Because it's when we do things just to escape, or we do it without even really having an intention behind why we're doing it, or thinking about why we're doing it, then that's where it becomes like a mindless activity that's really not fueling us anymore.
Yeah, so true.
Yeah, so love it. And so the other thing I wanted to kind of ask you, like I said in the cold questions I ask, how do you lead with your heart in your life? And you said it sort of depends on what I mean by heart. I think that sometimes, I think I might have to clearly define what I mean by heart. But for me, heart is like that feeling center, like that emotional center of your life. So how do you, like, in other words, what's your relationship with your emotions, right? Like, how do you, connect and relate to your emotions in your life?
Wow, that's a tough one. I think I've gone through quite a process in changing that a lot. And similar to that process I described earlier, when I was really focused on the negative for a long time, and then did a hyper jump to focusing on positive all the time. I think a lot of my life I trusted my emotions a bit too much. Like I just let them guide everything. And so if I was hurting for some reason, I just bury myself in it. Or if I was happy about something, I'd bury myself in that and just disregard everything else. And I still very much value and honor what my emotions are telling me. But I think as I've aged, I've started to kind of temper it a little bit with, I don't even want to say logic, because that emotions aren't the opposite of logic. I don't know the word I'm looking for here, but I've tempered it with something where I guess I question my emotions a little bit more now and ask, why am I feeling about this in a certain way? And just do a little bit more thinking on the root cause of it, I guess. I don't know if this is making any sense.
No, it is. You're inquisitive. So getting curious about your emotions is a really great emotional practice to have a good relationship with your emotions. One of the things that I'm actually noticing right now too in life is how to tell the difference and recognize when I'm experiencing an emotion versus when I get into a mood. Yeah. And so like for me, there's two things that I've learned that really help me figure out where I'm at. And one is, if it's an emotion, I can usually articulate or label it. Like I could say, like, I think I'm feeling irritated today. Like, I think I'm feeling really blessed today. Like I can label it. I can actually articulate it.
Okay.
And then the other thing is that an emotion, generally speaking, like from a biological way of viewing it, it's very momentary, right? It does not last. Emotions are fleeting, which is another reason why, chasing after happiness is kind of ridiculous, because happiness is an emotion and it doesn't last.
Right.
That's we're like trying to hold on to something that we can't hold on to. It's like trying to catch a butterfly in your hand.
Right.
So the emotional component of who I am as a human being doesn't last. But the moods, usually I can't articulate it in the same way. Like sometimes I'll wake up and I'm like, oh, I feel, it's more of like a blah. And to me, there's like this distinction. Blah to me isn't an emotional experience. It's just kind of like a heaviness or like I don't feel like it, right? And that to me is more of a mood. And the mood can last way longer than an emotion. So I think that might even be something that you were, kind of going through is like, and I also think, and I don't really have a whole lot of research to back this up because it's just this new thing that I'm kind of processing. But I think that if emotions aren't processed and they're compounded over time, I think they can it's possible that they could turn into more of a mood. And the mood is the thing that weighs you down, and keeps you either sinking in like some kind of toxic place.
Yeah.
So that's something I'm kind of working through. I don't know if that helps kind of, just our audience and you in general, but I think there is a difference between an emotional state and a mood state. And when we can learn to have the distinctive, like, cognitive awareness and relational awareness, it can help us move through that, different.
Yeah. I really like that. I'm gonna think that through next time I'm feeling something. Is this a mood or an emotion? Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
I funny enough, like, so the church that I go to, I often find people like sending me like devotionals or this and that, and a lot of people in sort of that circle of my faith contacts, like they'll say, well, your feelings are, liars. And I'm like, well, what do you mean by feelings? Because I'm like, emotions are not liars.
Yeah.
They are totally not liars. They actually, my instructor, Sue, was just like, they are data. Those are her, like, it is information, it is data for you. Your response to the data, so there is some logic in there. Your response to the data you're getting is where the power is, right?
Right on.
So anyway. Big, we're opening up a big ball of worms, but
yeah. You actually have me thinking about a tool I have for myself which I use in a lot of circumstances, but sometimes when I'm experiencing a heavy emotion or possibly a mood, this is a tool I use. And I made a list, and there's 6 words on this list, and it's basically my personal values. I've condensed them into 6 words for 6 values, and I keep them in my wallet so that the idea of keeping them in my wallet was anytime I pay for something, I open it up and they're there. So it tests, like, is this thing I'm paying for feeding at least one of these?
Yeah.
Because if it's not, what the heck am I doing? But I do refer to those when I'm experiencing something heavier too, and kind of going, well, which of these values is this challenging? Is that the problem? Because if this particular situation is butting up against one of my values, then my path forward will be a lot clearer if it happens.
That's brilliant.
Yeah,
because there's an unmet need when our values aren't being like implemented, right? So, well, thanks. I really appreciate you just kind of showing up as you to just share, the things that work for you. And, we're not here to like tell everybody we've got it all figured out, right? We just
I definitely don't.
we figured out some things along the way. We hope you've enjoyed our conversation and can take a nugget away from it and apply it or try it for your life or for someone you know. So yeah, thanks so much for being a part of the conversation, Cliff.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. This is fun.